And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard Eskow, and in the next couple segments, we're going to be looking at the Supreme Court case, the Hobby Lobby case, of alleged religious freedom of corporations versus rights of individuals when it comes to health coverage. And our next guest has been doing a lot of terrific writing on the subject. Ian Millhiser is senior constitutional policy analyst at the Center for American Progress Action Fund and the editor of Think Progress Justice. He has great educational background. He has written it for a number of publications, and he's an attorney, among other things, and his coverage of this case has been excellent. Ian, thanks so much for being with us.
It's good to be here. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And listen, you've written a lot of great things about this. And, the sense I get reading between the lines on your coverage is, and of course, I'll let you clarify, but maybe things aren't going so well. And particularly when it comes to Justice Kennedy, because Justice Kennedy brought abortions into the mix when I believe the subject is birth control. So, I guess two-part question. Am I right to be a little nervous now, where I wasn't quite as nervous before? And B, is Justice Kennedy part of it? And either way, what is Kennedy saying?
Sure. So, I think it's important to understand how very conservative this Supreme Court is. In a lot of cases, I feel like the justices read the briefs and they, chat with their clerks and they do their research, and what they discover is that they are Republicans and Barack Obama is a Democrat, and they base a lot of decisions on that kind of research. That said, initially, I was fairly optimistic when I was sitting in the room listening to the arguments the other day. And like you said, the moment where it flipped is where Justice Kennedy suddenly turns and he says to the Solicitor General, if we uphold this law under your theory, that means Congress could force corporations to pay for abortions. Now, there's all kinds of reasons that's not going to happen, but the problem with Kennedy is that Kennedy hasn't cast a pro-choice vote since 1992. So if we're relying on a guy who hasn't cast a pro-choice vote in 22 years, if he thinks that this is an abortion case, that's not good news.
Well, and what's interesting to me about that, just from a kind of process perspective, is I suppose there are many decisions that could be made in court or legislatively that, if taken to their extreme, could lead to an abortion. They might not even be health insurance for medical cases, right? I mean, you could say, for example, if you're required to provide any benefits to a full-time employee, if a state law, for example, passes that, well, that might eventually, 3 or 4 steps down the road, lead to abortion. But is it just my impression, or does that feel like a reach that he's now making this an abortion case?
It's definitely a reach. Hobby Lobby tried to make this into an abortion case because what's at stake here is whether or not an employer can refuse to cover birth control in their employee health plan, which is something they're required to do by law. There's nothing about abortion in the law. This is about birth control. Hobby Lobby tried to make it about abortion because they claim that several forms of birth control that are covered by the law actually are forms of abortion, but they're wrong. They're not forms of abortion. And in fact, there's a brief from several medical groups explaining, no, these forms of birth control, they have nothing to do with eggs implanting in the uterus. They have nothing to do with anything that someone could reasonably describe as an abortion. What they do, in most cases, they prevent ovulation. So, not an abortion.
And I have to say, just to interject for a second, that matter of my personal opinion, first of all, I think it's all insane, because I think that if people want to have an abortion under their health plan, I think they should be, personally, I think they should be able to. I think that's a matter of individual conscience, not legislation. And but if you don't mind my shifting a little bit, there's a fundamental philosophical issue here, which is the notion of corporate personhood, the idea that the corporation as an entity has religious beliefs that are violated. I mean, this is how I interpret it. I mean, I think I tweeted out the other day that Hobby Lobby's owners believe that life begins at the moment of incorporation. I mean, I think the idea that a corporation has such rights that those rights now extend to religious belief, quote unquote. Isn't that quite as? I mean, to me, that seems almost science fiction-y, and yet isn't that a fundamental presumption of this case?
Yeah, it's one of the two most important issues in this case, is whether or not corporations aren't just people, but now apparently they can be people of faith. And there's just something very weird about that concept. I disagree with the Citizens United case. The Citizens United case is the case that said that corporations could spend all the money they want to try to influence elections. But logistically, I know how that works. Like, if a corporation wants to give money to a super PAC, I know how a corporation cuts a check and gives it to a super PAC. How on earth does a corporation exercise religion? They don't go to church. They don't pray. If like the CEO, or if you put a yarmulke on their corporate headquarters, does that make it a Jewish corporation? If they wear a cross, does that, you put a cross on the building, does that make it a Christian? How does that actually work? I don't understand the logistics of how a corporation can have a religion.
Well, it's astonishing, and just a quick question. I'm going somewhere with this. I don't know this. Is Hobby Lobby publicly traded?
Now, Hobby Lobby is not publicly traded, and
Okay.
that's something that Chief Justice Roberts alluded to, is though there's no support in the law for this, maybe we could just say that these corporations that are held by a few family owners can have religions and publicly traded corporations cannot.
Well, and there's another dimension to this too, right? Which is that somehow where I'm going with this is, so somehow the religious beliefs of the owners exempt them from certain obligations, and yet the law exempts them from personal liability from the behavior of the corporation, doesn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
So,
Oh, go ahead.
So my faith as a corporation owner exempts me from certain obligations in their argument, but my personhood, while it extends to my faith, doesn't extend to, say, the criminal acts of the corporation or the negligent acts of the corporation.
Right. I mean, they're certainly trying to have their cake and eat it too, because the whole reason corporations exist is so that the corporation is a different legal entity from the people who own it. And that way, if the corporation does something wrong, the people can't necessarily be charged with anything. That means that if the corporation goes bankrupt, the people who invest in it aren't responsible for the debts of the corporation. And those are really important protections, and I think they should exist. But the price of those protections is that the corporation is not a human being, and it's not the human being who owns it. And for that reason, like I said, it's very difficult to think that how a corporation could have a religious faith.
See, I'm old enough to remember. I'm really old, and I'm old enough to remember the early '70s when I was in college, and there were two competing theories being floated around at the time, arguably from the left and the right. One was, there was a famous paper called "Should Trees Have Standing?" arguing that trees, as living beings, should be considered persons for court purposes, so that people could file briefs on their behalf to save forests and so on. The other was this Federalist Society notion of corporate personhood, and people went, now that's really crazy, to number two. Now, yet somehow trees don't have standing, but corporations are, it's being legitimately argued before the Supreme Court, who's accepted the case, have standing that is magical, that allows them to have faith without responsibility. What have I gotten wrong in this summary?
Yeah, the one thing I'll say is I think you can overplay the significance of the corporate personhood issue here, because that's actually not what I think is the most important issue in this case. The most important issue in this case is that for many decades, the Supreme Court has recognized essentially that my religious liberty stops at your body. So, I can have my beliefs, I can live my life the way I want, I can practice my faith the way I want, but the moment I start trying to exercise my faith in a way that steps on the rights of another person, or that hurts another person, or that tells them that they aren't allowed to have something that they're legally entitled to, that's what I'm not allowed to do. My religious liberty stops at your body, and that's fundamentally what Hobby Lobby is challenging here. They're trying to say that we're your employer, so we don't just get to pay you and decide what you have to do decide like what you have to do in order to get paid. We actually get to take away some of your legal rights because we object to those legal rights on religious grounds. And that's a scary road to go down if we start deciding that one person has the ability to impose their faith on another person.
Well, and let's play that out. Let's take that to its extreme, Kennedy style. Should Buddhist corporations or organizations be allowed not to pay taxes for food assistance that buys meat because they're vegetarian? Should Zoroastrian corporations who see the sacred reflected in fire be allowed not to contribute to their local firefighters? I mean, where does this end? I mean, isn't that also a dimension of the absurdity, in my opinion, that's my word, the absurdity of this case?
And that is the danger. Hobby Lobby is asking for, the way they put it in their brief, is whenever anyone has a religious objection to any law, that the government's only allowed to overcome that objection if they can survive the highest constitutional test known to constitutional law. They're asking for tremendous amounts of protection for religious liberty. And if you look at what the actual cases in the past have been, of course, you just had this big fight out in Arizona where people wanted to enshrine anti-gay discrimination into the law and say that if you object to serving gay people on religious grounds, you can do that. There are cases where employers said they want to pay women less than men because they thought that the man should be the head of the household, and that's God's plan. There are cases where people wanted to engage in race discrimination, and they claimed religious justification, people who didn't want to pay Social Security taxes, people who didn't want to pay the minimum wage. And if you
Right. Well, look, let's be clear. A major religion in this country until relatively recently believed that black people were inferior. So, can you discriminate against African Americans on religious grounds if this idea is upheld?
I mean, that's what the Bob Jones case was about in the 1980s. It was a case where you had a Christian college that at one point excluded black people altogether, and towards the end they just said that black people weren't allowed to date white people, and they had all these weird conduct restrictions.
And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Ian Millhiser, I'm delighted you're on this case, and I hope you'll come back and talk to us about it again.
Great, this has been fun.
You bet. Same here. Thanks again. We've been speaking with Ian Millhiser, whose writing can be found at thinkprogress.org/justice. And we will be staying on this case in our next segment. So please stick with us. I'm Richard Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.